Hello and welcome to Indus News Live with me, Usman Lone. Well, we begin this hour with our top story, and that's the Saudi-led coalition releasing 128 Houthi rebels as part of efforts to end the war in Yemen. The prisoners were flown to the Yemeni city of Sana'a on Red Cross planes. More in this report.
The development comes 2 days after the coalition said it would release 200 Houthi prisoners and ease restrictions on Yemeni airspace for patients requiring treatment abroad. The Red Cross says the release of the prisoners is a positive step towards peace. Yesterday, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman visited the United Arab Emirates to find a solution to end the conflict in Yemen. His visit coincides with a lull in Houthi attacks on Saudi Arabia launched from Yemeni soil and follows a senior official's statement in Riyadh this month, saying it has an open channel with Houthi rebels with the goal of ending the country's civil war. Tens of thousands of people have been killed and millions displaced in the conflict since 2015. The United Nations has termed the war in Yemen the world's worst humanitarian crisis.
Well, in neighbouring Iraq, 28 people have been shot dead during anti-government protests after demonstrators stormed the Iranian consulate. Medical sources said dozens of others were wounded. At least 24 people died when troops opened fire on demonstrators who blocked a bridge in the southern city of Nasiriyah. 4 others were killed in the capital Baghdad, where security forces used live rounds and rubber bullets. This is the second attack on an Iranian consulate in Iraq this month, after the first attack was a consulate in Karbala, and that was targeted 3 weeks ago. Foreign Ministry spokesman Abbas Mousavi said it's Baghdad's responsibility to ensure the safety of diplomatic missions and diplomats. Over 350 people have been killed in Iraq's violent protests over the past 2 months. Well, Iran says it will soon have joint naval exercises with Russia and China in the Indian Ocean. Commander of the Iranian Navy, Rear Admiral Hossein Khanzadi, said the military exercises were planned last month and the participants are in preparations for the joint exercises. Khanzadi did not specify the date of the maneuvers, but last month Russia said Moscow, Beijing and Tehran will train their forces for anti-terrorism and anti-piracy operations in joint military exercises. Now, closer to home in Pakistan, the Supreme Court grants a 6-month conditional extension to Army Chief General Qamar Javed Bajwa. The court asked the government to make the necessary legislation on the extension of an Army Chief's tenure within 6 months. Prime Minister Imran Khan extended Bajwa's term in August, but the top court suspended it due to irregularities in the extension. While pronouncing the short order, the court said the new legislation must determine the Army Chief's tenure and other terms and conditions of his service. A detailed judgment will be released later. Well, staying with news in Pakistan, and Prime Minister Imran Khan says Pakistan is climbing out of its economic crisis. He was addressing a conference about Africa in Islamabad, and Khan said the country's current account deficit has decreased. Khan said his government is trying to bring investment to Pakistan. He said Pakistan will focus on trade policies towards African countries as well. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi also addressed the conference. Mr. Qureshi said promoting tourism and enhancing trade are Pakistan's top priorities. According to a Foreign Office statement, the conference is aimed at strengthening Pakistan's ties with Africa. Now, in India, ruling BJP lawmaker Pragya Thakur's controversial remarks on Mahatma Gandhi's murderer has caused an outrage. Thakur called Nathuram Godse a patriot during a discussion in the lower house of parliament yesterday. Reacting to her statement, Congress leader Rahul Gandhi said it's a sad day in the history of India's parliament. In a tweet, he termed Thakur a terrorist. And this is not the first time the BJP lawmaker defended Gandhi's murderer. She made the same comment days before the general elections in May. She went on to win the elections from Bhopal with a majority of 200,000 votes. Thakur is currently on bail on terrorism charges in India. The US says the chances of successful negotiations to end the war in Afghanistan are greater than ever before. Speaking in Kabul, US Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley said a deal with the Taliban could be struck very soon. Pakistan's permanent representative to the UN, Munir Akram, said Islamabad supports Afghanistan's pursuit of peace and stability. This was also echoed by China's representative to the UN, Zhang Jun. He said Beijing backs an Afghan-led and owned inclusive political process. Now, China has summoned US Ambassador Terry Branstad over the US President's approval of a law backing anti-government protesters in Hong Kong. China's foreign ministry said the US should immediately stop interfering in its internal affairs. China's foreign ministry said the US would bear the consequences for acting without constraint on Hong Kong. Foreign Minister Wang Yi said laws against Beijing have seriously poisoned relations between both countries. Hong Kong's government said the US bill sent the wrong message to protesters and it clearly interfered with the city's affairs. Well, Seoul says North Korea has test-fired 2 unidentified projectiles into the East Sea. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff said the projectiles were fired from South Hamgyong province. Japan's Coast Guard confirmed North Korea launched what appeared to be a missile. Its defense ministry said the missile did not enter Japanese airspace. Now, this is the 13th time this year that North Korea has carried out such tests. Well, a week before NATO leaders meet in the UK for its 70th anniversary, President Emmanuel Macron says he stands by his claim that the alliance is experiencing a brain death. Speaking alongside NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg in Paris, Macron says his statement was meant as a wake-up call. He said member states lack cooperation on key issues facing the alliance. Macron said he doesn't consider Russia and China enemies, and he urged NATO members to engage with President Vladimir Putin on security issues. President Macron also questioned the alliance's failure to respond to Turkey's military operation in Syria. And he said NATO needs to clarify who or what the alliance stood against. Meanwhile, General Stoltenberg says the foundations of NATO are strong and it will continue to modernize itself. 2 Turkish soldiers have been killed in a mortar attack on a military base near the Syrian border. Turkey's defense ministry said the shells were fired from the Syrian border town of Tel Abyad. It said Turkish forces immediately retaliated against the attackers. The attack targeted a base which Turkey seized last month in a military operation against the Kurdistan Workers' Party, also known as the PKK. Syria's government has blocked the Constitutional Committee meetings in Geneva for a 3rd consecutive day. Speaking to reporters, the committee co-chair Hadi al-Bahra accused the government of stalling. Al-Bahra said Damascus wanted to add an item to the agenda that fell outside the framework of the constitution. Syrian government officials also rejected all 3 proposals made by the opposition. Ahmad Khuzbari, the committee co-chair representing the Syrian government, said it had wanted to condemn Turkey's operation in northern Syria. The 2nd round of the committee dialogue began on Monday this week. Well, we'll be back with more news from around the world right after this short break, so do stay with us. Hello again, it's good to have you back. Now in the Democratic Republic of Congo, 4 health workers have been killed and 5 wounded in attacks against 2 Ebola response centers in the eastern part of the country. A local militia attacked the Ebola workers complex in Ituri province. A World Health Organization official said 1 health worker is missing following the attack. The head of the Ebola response center said the attack is a blow to a disease containment efforts in the country. Earlier, the WHO evacuated 49 staff members of its Ebola team from the town of Beni due to security concerns. The WHO spokesman said law and order must be restored to carry out vital operations. 99 people have been killed by armed groups in the Beni town area since the 5th of November. A Swedish court has ordered Russian gas company Gazprom to pay over $2.5 billion in compensation to Ukraine's Naftogaz. Sweden's Court of Appeal upheld a March 2018 ruling by a Stockholm court over a dispute on the supply and transit of natural gas. The current 10-year contract between the two countries for the transit of Russian gas through Ukraine runs out at the end of this year. Russia plans to launch two new gas pipelines, the Nord Stream 2 and the Turk Stream, to bypass Ukraine. But last week, Naftogaz said it would seek compensation of nearly $12 billion if Russia stops the gas transit trade in 2020. Now, Google has sent warnings to over 500 users in India, alerting them to government-backed phishing attempts. The tech giant said over 90% of affected users were targeted with phishing emails that could be led back to the government. Google said attempts were made to obtain the target's password or account details to hijack the account. Google's threat analysis group works to counter targeted and government-backed hacking against the corporation and its customers. Chilean President Sebastián Piñera urges his countrymen to shun violence, saying it can cause irreparable harm to the country. A spike in arson and looting attacks nationwide has shook Chile. Meanwhile, the peso plunged to a new low on Tuesday. Piñera had urged Congress to expedite bills he introduced weeks ago to toughen security and penalties against violence. Lawmakers agreed to push reforms but said the government hadn't done enough to stem the crisis. Human Rights Watch expressed its concerns regarding police brutality during the 5-week-long protests.
The abuses committed by police on the basis of the information and evidence we have are not isolated cases, they are not coincidences, and they are not accidents.
Now, Los Angeles is home to the largest urban oil field in the United States. Hundreds of oil wells can be found in densely populated, mostly low-income neighborhoods. Now, residents and activists are demanding they be phased out, citing health and environmental concerns. More in this report.
Mention Los Angeles and most people will think of the glitz and glam of Hollywood, but the city's landscape has also included hundreds of active drilling sites for decades. Over the years, these have become unwelcome neighbors to several LA residents.
These shouldn't be in our communities. They are a source of air pollution, short-term, and long-term they're part of the climate crisis. So we should figure out how to clean up these sites, if folks need housing or more green space. But really it's about communities coming together to reclaim their land.
LA's long history of oil production is most apparent on Signal Hill, which was once called Porcupine Hill because of the large number of oil derricks covering it.
I don't pretend to be totally educated on the risks of being near them, but I definitely think that they're not something that should be where people are living. And if there's initiatives to push them back, then I support that.
But there are still plenty of LA residents who rely on the oil sector. And those defending the oil sector point out the US produced only 12 million barrels of oil in 2018 compared to 26 million in 2008. Additionally, cutting down on local production to import more oil will only create more emissions, apart from making it harder for the American military to leave the Middle East. This goes to show, as long as the American economy remains dependent on oil, there is no easy solution to the problem.
The European Parliament has declared a climate emergency in a symbolic vote ahead of the UN Global Crisis Summit. The resolution was passed with 429 lawmakers in favour, while 225 went against it. The motion urges the Commission to ensure that all legislative and budgetary proposals are aligned to limit global warming to under 2 degrees Celsius. The Parliament has also urged the EU to submit its strategy to reach climate neutrality as soon as possible. Lawmakers called on the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to include a 55% emissions reduction target for 2030. Speaking in the Parliament yesterday, von der Leyen said Europe must lead the world in the fight against climate change. Now, in other news, astronomers have discovered a huge black hole in the Milky Way, challenging existing models of the production of stars. Researchers say the LB1 is 15,000 light years from Earth and has a mass 70 times greater than the Sun. Scientists believe that there are two types of black holes, stellar and supermassive. LB1 is a new type formed by a physical mechanism so far unknown to science. It was discovered by an international team of scientists using China's LAMOST telescope. Additional images from two of the world's largest optical telescopes confirmed the size of LB1. A rare portrait of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart has sold for €4 million at Christie's auction house in Paris. It passed the pre-sale estimate of €1.2 million. The work, one of 4 paintings of the composer, was made in 1770, and it was being attributed to Italian painter Giambettino Signoroli. The portrait was ordered by Venetian General Pietro Luggiati after a concert by Mozart in Verona. The oil canvas depicts a 13-year-old Mozart in a white wig and a red coat playing the harpsichord.
What's very interesting about that portrait is the musical score, because it's actually only known from that portrait. So some musicologists have said it could be the work of Mozart himself, who wrote that when he was young and left it behind to the commissioner.
Now in Switzerland, climate activists have delivered a petition of 112,000 signatures calling for greater action on climate change. The Glacier Initiative, as it's called, was collecting signatures in the space of 5 months to try to trigger a referendum there, but they say it should have been done 20 years ago. More in this report.
The initiative's goal is to set a clear target of zero greenhouse gas emissions by abandoning the use of fossil fuels. Although the government said emissions would be cut to zero by 2050, it didn't announce binding measures or a timeline.
Switzerland has signed the Paris Agreement, as have about 130 countries, but politically speaking, not much has been put in place to reach the agreement's target. That is the reason why we launched this initiative, to force impact and decisions, and to have a change.
More than 500 Swiss glaciers have already vanished. If nothing is done to cut emissions, the government says 90% of the remaining 1,500 will be gone by the end of the century. Activists carried Greenpeace lanterns carrying the motto, "We have no planet B."
Yes, we are a bit too late, but we can't go backwards. We should have started 20 years ago, that is for sure. But now we have to put all our efforts in what we can still do. Yesterday's report from the United Nations says that we globally have to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 7.6% every year.
Glacial retreat could have a major impact on the supply of water and affect the Swiss economy.
Well, we'll be back with the world of news from business and sports right after this short break. Welcome back. Now in business news, the US economy has expanded in the third quarter with GDP growing at an annual rate of 2.1%. The latest data exceeds the US Federal Reserve Bank's expectations of economic growth dipping under 2%. In a survey, the Fed said the growth reported by the government came alongside a drop in unemployment benefits. The survey showed retailers reporting higher costs from tariffs, while firms generally expect higher prices in the near future. Meanwhile, the US Department of Commerce has said business investment dropped by over 2.5% between July and September. This was better than the expected 3% contraction. Well, it's 16 degrees here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that's all from me and the team here in Lahore. We'll be back at the top of the hour with the headlines. And don't forget, for the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Bye-bye.